broglio is concerned, it's also what some parts of Canada is dealing with. I've read in the news about what happened in Ontario last Friday when a trade union had to go on strike, leaving many schools closed. I've also read about the fact that there's a new act now that seeks to to ensure that pupils and students are in class. We therefore criminalizes going on strike by unionists in Ontario, in Canada, and it can even lead to payments of up to $4,000 in a fine for anybody who contravenes, that law. It looks to me, therefore, like that it's not only Nigeria that is dealing with labor unions in the education sector agitating for better pay, going on strike, putting students, in a lot of troubles and trauma. How do you think that this can be dealt with in Nigeria especially, and how is it being dealt with the situation that you have at hand in Canada where you're based?
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, good question. There are certain particularities of the education sector. I would like to mention two that is very germane. The first and perhaps the most important to me is the fact that every time there's an industrial crisis in the education sector, it is the students that bear the brunt. It's the students that don't go to school. It's peculiar to the education sector. If there was a strike in the oil industry or in fast-moving consumer goods, young people don't bear the brunt. So directly, but in the case of the education sector, young people bear the brunt. Secondly, is the fact that the unions in the education sector are typically some of the biggest. So if it's teachers union or if it's union of support staff, they're typically the biggest in terms of numbers. So they have the number, and because they have the number with check of dues, they have the financial muscle to make things to happen. Now, because of those two peculiarities, the state has to take a decision. And that question is, every time there's a disagreement between employers and labor union in the education sector, what happens to those children? And that's always a key question, because if there's a strike, the first person who feels the effect of the strike are the students. And therefore the state, let's always remember this, that the state has an obligation to children by virtue of, in Nigeria, the child rights laws, by virtue of various laws all over the world. In fact, on some instances, the state has bigger rights over a child than the parents. If you remember the Sabuno versus Faweya case, where it was clearly established that if a child is still a minor, the state has a responsibility to take over the role of the parent if the parent abdicates his role for that child. Now, that's always a crisis that happens. And that's what happened, for example, last week in Ontario, where, for example, not the teachers union, there are 5 teachers union in Ontario, but there's a union called CUPE, that is the union of the support staff, decided to give a strike notice. They gave a 17-day notice, then they gave a 5-day notice, as the case may be. And then the state decided to go, and rather than, like we had in the case of Nigeria, where the Minister of Labour went to court after the strike started, what the state, in this case, Ontario province, did was to go and pass a law that says, 1, you can't go on strike. 2, if you go on strike, both the union and the members will pay a fine on a daily basis. Number 3, because they couldn't agree on a collective agreement on payment, the law prescribed the agreements. So rather than a collective agreement, a law determined what they will be paid. And finally, puts a master stroke and says, you can't even say this is against the constitution or what they call the charter in a place like Canada. So what they did was to forestall the strike. But the union leaders said they will still go ahead with the strike. And interestingly, if you compare it to, for example, like when we had the case of National Association of Resident Doctors, that the court gave a judgment and they still went ahead with the strike. So they said they were going to go against the strike. And then the state quickly ran to the labor board to declare the strike illegal, because when that body declares the strike illegal, then those fines can start to come in. Interestingly, the case, I was still monitoring the proceedings till about 10 p.m. in the night. So the proceedings, they walked throughout yesterday, they walked throughout on Friday. We're still awaiting the final job. But the question is, what is the role of the state when schools will be shut down as a result of strike? That has always been the classical question. And what has happened all over the world is various jurisdiction has decided how to handle it. So some countries of the world, for example, have said teachers are essential duties, and therefore they can't go on strike. I mean, so the countries in the world have taken that stand. Some countries of the world have taken a stand that where there is a disagreement with teachers' union or unions in the education sector and their employers, third-party mediation must happen immediately. So that's one extreme where some states says you can't even go on strike. Now, you also have some place that has become laissez-faire where people in the education sector can go on strike. So we have, like, for example, the case in Nigeria where ASUU goes on strike, where SANU goes on strike, where SANU goes on strike. And where some state governments have actually declared trade union or some trades has been essential, like we had in the case in the Southeast where a governor declared and then the union went to court and the governor lost because it's only the president that can declare a profession as an essential duty for the sake of labor union. So you have those two extremes of international jurisdiction around it. And there's always tension because the ILO, the International Labour Organization, always wants the right of workers to strike to be sustained. But society needs to balance between those two extremes. Do we allow them to go on strike as they like on one hand, or do we say they can't go on strike? And that's where we are all over the world. The tension remains, and it's going to take a while to do that. And we have the same problem in Nigeria. They dealt with teachers' strike in Canada. I should say they are currently dealing with it. There's a plethora of cases in South Africa that shows that countries that have put up restrictive regime has also said, we're not going to even allow you to go on strike at all. So those are the two extremes, and each country finds a way to balance to stay within the two extremes or to stay in one of the extremes.
All right, Yomi. Some will say that Canada is a peculiar case, understanding that truckers have gone on strike. It has yielded some kind of result. Even maple syrup producers have even gone on strike, and they've seen something come out of it. For Nigeria, strike actions, especially in the education sector, has cost people a lot of years. And we've not seen any major change from all the strike actions. Do you think that strike actions are the best way out for the unions to probably air their grievances and press on government to meet their demands? Or do you think there is a better way, looking at the peculiarity that surrounds Nigeria, looking at the fact that when you look at the antecedents in time past, the plethora of strikes that have yielded no result, it's just simply kicking the can down the road or probably moving in a cycle?
Okay, thank you. Very, very, very great question. Maybe I should just clarify this. The truckers' protest, which was essentially heavy in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and then to towns and also in towns like Windsor, which is the border town with the US, was not an employee strike. It was not employer strike. It was strike of people who decided to prevail on the state to get what they wanted out of it. So they are not in the nature of that. For the syrup strike, it's more or less like a private sector organization versus these employees. But in the case of education, it's a public sector initiative. Now, the question is, do strikes work? Of course, strikes work. I mean, we need to accept it because that is perhaps the last tool available to employees to force the hands of their employers. And if we say strike have not worked in Nigeria, if we actually do a real study about it, strikes have worked, particularly in the higher institution sector. Whether you want to think about the incremental change in salaries of academic staff that happened under the Obasanjo administration. I used to be a lecturer in the Federal University at that point, and I knew how my salary jumped astronomically just because of the strike. Or whether it's because of how, for example, strike prevailed on the case of the University of the Ilorin lecturers that were sacked. So the reason why labor union like strike is that in Nigeria, there is a positive reinforcement for strikes. Because if employees are agitating and they are being ignored, then they have to leverage on that. And, once you do a cessation of work, the employer starts to suffer. So there's been some effect. But the question, and that's always the question to ask, ideally, public policy analysis is based on the classical cost-benefit model. what costs are we using to get these benefits? So, for example, now ASUU just went on strike for excess of 7-8 months in Nigeria. Question is, whatever they even get from it, is it worth not running school for that long? That's always a classical question. And in particular, in the case of this like ASUU strike, if we actually want to be very objective, there is nothing ASUU went on strike for. The ASUU president gave a list of, I think it's about 7 or 8 items that he listed were the core issues they want. As of today, after 8-9 months of strike, or 7-8-9 months of strike, none of them has been done. Even the simplest one, the one that is just administrative, which is release of the white paper, of the visitation panels, has not even been done. That one does not even cost money. I'm not talking about the monetary, I'm talking about just the one about just release of a document. So you have gone on strike for excess of 7 months to get 8 things, and not one of them has been done till now. So anybody who is interested in public policy, we ask that simple question: what is the benefit of the strike? One, to you that went on strike, that's the ASUU members. Secondly, to the sector, and that refers to every stakeholder in the system, and then to society. Because the challenge is always that it is not really worth it. I like the model that is done in some European countries. What they have done for the educational sector is, once there is a disagreement as regards anything that is part of the collective agreement, an independent mediator is brought in, and the laws prescribe how long that mediation must take. So let's assume government is negotiating with ASUU and there's a breakdown. Either of them can write to the labor board, and then the labor board will set up an individual mediator that has some weeks, some months, that must do the mediation, and the mediator will prescribe a solution, and that ends it. I like that model because it's time-bound, it's professional, it uses a third party, and it also gets the result quickly. But for me, I mean, and I've said it many times on this station, at the base of the ASUU federal government strike is one issue. ASUU should not be going into negotiation with the federal government of Nigeria. Reason, the employer of ASUU members is not the federal government of Nigeria. The employers of members of ASUU is the council of the various universities. Therefore, ASUU of UNILAG should go into an agreement with the Council of the University of Lagos. ASUU members of University of Abuja should have agreement with the Council of University of Abuja. The problem we have, and you know, in the intro, there was a talk about the role of Dr. Ngigi. He has no business in this. A collective agreement is defined by law as an agreement between an employee union and the employer. In Nigeria, the employer of the university staff is not the federal government of Nigeria. It is the council of the universities. Let me tell you what will surprise you. If the federal government decide, I'm not saying if, I give instance during the time of the Obasanjo administration, where a visitation panel was set up to a university and they took a decision from the federal government to lay off some staff. Those staff went to court and argued and won that the federal government is not the employer. Therefore, the federal government cannot give instruction for them to be sacked. So if the federal government wants to sack staff, members of academic staff and non-academic staff in university run to court and say, federal government is not our employer. But when they want more money or more benefit, they go and negotiate there. So at the base of this is the fact that they are negotiating with somebody who is not the employer. Their employer too is enjoying the game and playing along with them. The problem is each union of each university should sign agreement with the council. At that point, the solution comes as quickly as possible. And I'm surprised nobody in the Ministry of Labor is talking about it, because everybody knows that's the solution. Everybody knows all those federal government initiated negotiation is legal. By law, if any Nigeria goes to court to contest the powers of the federal government negotiating with ASUU, federal government knows it's going to lose because they are doing what is illegal. But unfortunately, we sometimes like to run system of illegality in Nigeria.
All right. I mean, that's actually very direct, to the point. But I'm wondering, can you be a bit more prescriptive in what you think could, eventually change the course of things? Because it looks to me like all the rounds of discussions, has failed, and with the no pay, no work, no pay rule, even though what is said is that a worker deserves his wage and nobody wants to labor in vain, we may have sooner than later another round of strike from ASUU. But with government, having formed KONUA, having formed NAMDA, what will you prescribe as something that can actually take Nigerian students, especially because you did mention the fact that they are at the receiving end of all this? What can actually bring sanity, lasting sanity, to this imbroglio between ASUU and the federal government in terms of specific prescriptions?
For me, a couple of initiatives. I just want to mention two critical ones. One is a quicker movement towards university autonomy. I became a lecturer in a Nigerian university, public university, in 1996. That's when I started teaching in the Nigerian universities. And I was a member of ASUU. At that point, we were, autonomy is like a band. You start like 100 and maybe you start from 0 and maybe 100 is the maximum. It's like a band. We were like 5 or 6 on that band then. But ASUU took it upon itself to fight for autonomy. Unfortunately, the way ASUU have chosen to now, and I'm saying this because there is a change in the leadership of ASUU and the ideological capacity of ASUU to confront issues. There's been a radical change. And we need to accept that. It's obvious from what you see when you hear interviews of some of the current leaders. I mean, you compare it to some of those leaders of those times, and you can see that there is a change in the capacity to respond to issues. It was the same ASUU, for example, that came up with TED Fund, Education Trust Fund as it was. Why have that system not brought something? So you have a situation. So we were like a 5 or 10 on that 0 to 100 band then. But ASUU was more focused on moving us on the scale of autonomy around what will make it more powerful in the appointment of vice chancellors. So today we have Nigerian laws, University Ministerial Act, that now gives not ASUU as an association, but members of the universities the power to appoint vice chancellor. It never happened in the 90s when I joined the university system, for example. So today now, when they want to appoint a new vice chancellor, the Senate and Council form a committee, Senate vote, this one. So staff are more involved. And I'm so happy. I mean, everybody I'm talking to here work in an organization, perhaps the only organization in Nigeria where staff employ their CEO, votes and determine their CEO is the university system. That's why, for example, throughout the time of the 6-7 month ASUU strike, if you notice, Committee of Vice Chancellor of Federal University was not speaking straight. They were going this way and going this way, and because they know if they lose the support of ASUU members, they are done. So we have created a situation where effectively vice chancellor of Nigerian public universities are practically like trade union leaders because they rely on the trade unions to get to power. So what my first prescription therefore is a movement further on that autonomy situation. And what does that directly impact? That means each university is autonomous. UNILAG is not the same as University of Ibadan. Therefore, agreeing or signing agreements or paying lecturers of Federal University of Nigeria with Federal University of Nigeria or Yelkiti the same salary cannot be autonomy. Cannot be autonomy. Each council should determine what it wants to pay. Let me ask you a question, and I'm so happy. I mean, the people in the studio have been around for a while. How many trade unions in Nigeria have national labor agreements? For people in the media industry, you have what they call RATAU, Radio and Theatre Workers Association. Is there a RATAU agreement with federal government? No. Why is there not? Because RATAU is supposed to have an agreement in Arise TV, in this television station, in this radio station, But in Nigeria, the only person, two sets, the doctors and the university staff are the ones that go to negotiate with that are not the employers. So the autonomy is to ensure each university take responsibility for its labor relations. Except we go back to that point, we'll never make any progress in this country. That's the first one. The second one is very much related to it, and that is the selection of people that have the capacity to become members of council. A university is run and managed. A university, the custodian of the university is a council led by the pro-chancellor. What has happened in Nigeria in the recent times is that the membership of council has practically become a political issue. So we had cases in Nigeria where people who did not go to university were members of council. Now, that second part is very critical because it's about the capacity of the employers to be able to manage the university. If you actually check the University Act in Nigeria, when the University of Ibadan started, when the Yaba College of Technology started, there was no law that established them. The first university in Nigeria that had a law that established was the University of Lagos Act, 1962. If you check it, the only word used around financing university, the only person that has responsibility to finance university is the council. There is no law that says federal government should finance any university in Nigeria. And you can check any law. I can say for a fact. The man who has ruled.
Yomi, I want to say thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to say thank you for this engaging discussion we had this morning.
Thank you.